Hello, Clarice. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jonathan Demme's pivotal horror film, The Silence of the Lambs, which spends a good amount of time just on Jodie Foster being either uncomfortable or afraid. So The Silence of the Lambs is a really fascinating film. It is one of the most iconic psychological horror movies ever made. I'm gonna talk some about the content, but I also think there's some really interesting cinematic stuff that's worth talking about. So first, the basic storyline of The Silence of the Lambs is you have this FBI Academy student, Jodie Foster, playing Clarice Starling. She gets sort of recruited by a professor of hers to try and get information from an incredibly intelligent and insightful psychopathic serial killer and cannibal named Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins. Amazing performance by Hopkins. What Starling is told that she's going to do is basically just sort of general research about psychopathy. What she's actually there to do is try and get a psychological profile and maybe even direct information about another serial killer known as Buffalo Bill. So there's two sort of broad storylines, in my opinion, to this movie. And while there's overlap, I kind of don't see them as that thoroughly connected. There's the relationship between Clarice and Hannibal, and then there's the hunt for Buffalo Bill. And yes, they're connected in that Hannibal, ostensibly at least, knows the identity of Buffalo Bill, and he gives the police and various law enforcement agencies clues that are sometimes not real clues, etc., etc. He plays a lot of psychological games. I think that element of the film is absolutely fascinating. The psychological manipulation and even to a degree torture of Clarice Starling by Hannibal Lecter I think is really, really interesting, but also the way she tries to play back against him. Because she's not just a passive victim of this. She does attempt to utilize her own intelligence and her own ability to achieve her ends. Then there's the hunt for Buffalo Bill, which in some, to me, it's much more of a sort of straightforward police investigating serial killer type storyline. There is a twist. The twist, I think, is problematic because Buffalo Bill is kind of maybe a transsexual, which was a no longer necessarily as current term for a trans person. This is problematic. But I'll talk about that in just a second. I actually think the storyline with Buffalo Bill is, one hesitates to say boring, but I think it's much more predictable. It's much more simple in a way. And in part, this is because the storyline with Hannibal, and Hannibal as a character, is so interesting as this intelligent, manipulative, but also somewhat weirdly charming, brutal killer. He's so contradictory and so insightful, so able to unsettle people just with language and with his insight into who they are as people. He's a fascinating character. Buffalo Bill, on the other hand, he's interesting, but I think he pales in comparison as a character to Hannibal Lecter. And so in that sense, I'm not super fascinated by the pursuit of him, by the attempt to catch him. So Buffalo Bill, he murders women and takes their skin. Ostensibly, he is sewing the skins together to make himself a woman's suit. Hannibal Lecter knows him from Hannibal's time as a therapist. He apparently met at least the person that he thinks is Buffalo Bill, met him once. And Hannibal claims he's not a real transsexual. It's something along the lines of he is personally unfulfilled, psychologically unbalanced, and so he thinks that he is a woman trapped in a man's body, but according to Hannibal, that's not really what's going on with him. It's also hard to tell because Hannibal is not a reliable source of information. It does seem quite clear that there is some degree of maybe gender dysmorphia. It's not super clear exactly because we don't get any sort of reliable psychological insights. But this storyline is a very problematic storyline. I was watching something on YouTube or maybe reading something a while back about the problem of queer-coded villains, whether they are explicitly identified as queer, whether that's gay, whether that's more rarely lesbian, whether that's transgender, whatever it is. This is a huge problem, actually, because it identifies in the public consciousness the idea of being LGBT with the idea of criminality. So a comparison is that after the movie Jaws came out, people started killing sharks at increasing rates. They would kill sharks for no particularly good reason because the movie Jaws cemented in the public consciousness the idea that sharks are dangerous, human-killing beasts. But that's not really the case with sharks. Yes, sharks do sometimes kill humans, but that's the exception rather than the rule. The same thing kind of occurs when you have queer-coded villains. That is, villains who read as gay, lesbian, trans, whatever it is, whether or not they're explicitly identified that way. This is a huge problem because the association, again, is made in the public consciousness between being queer and being a criminal, when in reality, LGBT people are orders of magnitude more likely to be the victims of violent crime and sexual assault than they are to be the perpetrators of those things. So it's an incredibly problematic association because it demonizes people who are already socially marginalized. So this figure of Buffalo Bill, there are big problems with him because, again, A, I don't find him super interesting compared to the much more fascinating Hannibal Lecter, and B, having a trans character or potentially trans whatever it is character problematically associates the idea of trans people with the idea of serial killers. So that's my sort of content level analysis. The other thing that I was really struck by with this film is the camera work. There's so much reliance on close-ups and ultra close-ups. And it's a really effective cinematic technique for this genre, for the psychological horror genre. We get so many, actually Jodie, like so much of this film, I'd say probably like 30% or more, that's just my rough estimate, is just Jodie Foster in close-up. So we maybe get the top portion of her body, but we're getting just Jodie Foster's facial expressions. We get these ultra close-ups, sometimes just of Anthony Hopkins' face in these very sort of sinister moments where where Hannibal Lecter is getting Clarice to tell him things about herself. And he's sort of building this psychological assessment of her. With Buffalo Bill, because it is a decent while into the movie before we actually see this character, really. But we also get these close-ups of his lips as he's putting lip gloss, I think. I don't know, I'm not a makeup person. A lip gloss or something like that. We get these close-ups of his pierced nipple. We get these are ultra close-ups of the lip gloss, ultra close-ups of the pierced nipple, ultra close-ups of, he puts on this necklace of, I can picture it, I can't remember what the name of it is. I want to say the Venus of Dusseldorf, but that may be wrong. I'll put a picture of it up on the screen. But we get these ultra close-ups. And the thing that does, this reliance on close-ups and ultra close-ups, one is it makes the character's psychology central because we're seeing that facial expression, we're seeing the anxiety, especially from Jodie Foster, we're seeing the sadistic pleasure from Anthony Hopkins, etc., etc. But that also makes the movie feel very claustrophobic. It feels very closed in because we don't have much space on the screen. We never get really broad panoramic views. We get a couple of times where we have aerial shots of rivers or things like that, where Buffalo Bill has dumped the bodies of his victims. But we don't get these really broad, sweeping panoramic scenes, which would give us a sense of openness and freedom. Instead, we get these closed-in camera angles, and that heightens the tension. It heightens our fear. It heightens our anxiety, because it almost mimics being in a prison cell. Or Buffalo Bill has this sort of pit dungeon thing in his basement that's comparatively small, and he keeps his victims there. It mimics, the camera work mimics that feeling of being closed in and being trapped, and it builds our anxiety as viewers. It's really masterfully done in terms of the camera work for this film.